All right. Good morning, everybody. We're thrilled to have you join us for our Every Day is Earth Day webinar series hosted by Emerald Built Environments. Today, we're talking about defining scopes. My name is Lisa Pim Peterson, and I'm the growth manager here at Emerald. Next slide. We have a couple of housekeeping items. One is please feel free to ask questions during the presentation in the Q&A feature, and we'll hold time at the end. As you can see, I will, as moderator, pose those questions during the last few minutes. And we are recording today's session. It is recording now, so we will be posting that online, and we'll send you all a notification when that is available. Next slide, please. Today's presenter is our founder and managing member of Emerald, Laura Steinbrink. Laura has an unparalleled understanding and passion for sustainability and how we can all make a difference in the design, construction, and maintenance of all building types. She has been in business since 2008, assisting clients along their sustainability journey. With that, let's get started. Laura, take it away.
Thank you so much, Lisa, for that introduction, and thanks to everyone who has joined today. So just a little quick about Emerald Built Environments. This company is based in Cleveland, Ohio, and we have been working across the United States and internationally for nearly 15 years. There are 10 of us full-time on the team. We have a 2030 goal that is really important and drives us every day. And it's by the year 2030, we will have enhanced 2,030 sustainable environments. And we're thrilled that that number is over 1,400 at this point in time and growing. One of the things that is really important to us is focusing on helping our clients meet their goals and doing it in a team environment way. We're really focused on being collaborative and supportive and helping our teams get to where they want to go. I do also want to note that we're B Corp certified and have gone through the process of demonstrating our own carbon neutrality, having that verified for the 12-month period ending in June 30th of 2022. So today's webinar is about understanding the emission scopes. This is what I would call an entry-level webinar. We are not going to get too deep into the topics today because what we've come to understand is that collectively, we're all still learning. This is new territory that we are being called upon to respond to, whether or not it's from internal mission or from external stakeholders. And so what we're going to do today is establish why we're talking about this at all, hoping to leave you with nuggets that connect to your own personal mission or your business mission, reviewing the definitions of scopes 1, 2, and 3. We're leaving 4 off the table for now. We're going to connect you with ideas about how to get started on an inventory for yourself and for your organization, and then take your questions at about the 20-minute mark into this conversation. So let's just take a quick snapshot at this chart, which is showing us the greenhouse gas emissions in the global atmosphere since 1750. And if you understand how to read the chart, which is pretty simple, left to right, that spike started in the industrial era, and continues to climb. And then if we look at it by sector specific to the United States, we can see where those emissions are coming from. And it's an interesting cut on this version of where those emissions come from to the next slide that I'm about to show you, which breaks it down a little bit differently by taking electric power out and redistributing it to the end uses. And one of the reasons that we start here to try to understand where they're coming from is it allows us individually and collectively to understand what our opportunities are to make change. And as we're in this space of discussing emissions and trying to get to net zero goals or carbon neutrality goals, we have to just understand where to begin and what can we as individuals and collectively as companies affect. Where is our opportunity to bring change, and how can we help those that we serve understand their impact and help them get to the same place of reducing emissions. So when we take that electrical sector piece and redistribute it to where it's being used, we see that the dynamic shifts and that buildings become the #1 place where emissions are generated. And that's what Emerald focuses on. We are a consulting firm that day to day focuses on helping organizations reduce the emissions from the built environment. So why do we care about emissions? Like, why is this conversation important today more than it might have been 10 years ago or not? I would argue the importance has not changed, but it's what is connecting people to it and what is bringing people into the conversation, that why they were motivated to sign up for today's webinar, or why they're starting to ask questions about what is our carbon profile and how can we reduce it. So there's lots of different reasons, but the #1 reason that we have heard, and I think the evidence holds true, is that stakeholders are demanding it. So let's define stakeholders for a minute. In the business setting, it's your employees. We know certainly that younger employees today want to work for a company that cares about the environment and is going to do everything it can to protect it. We know that people with children and grandchildren who care about the human race want the planet to be here so that future generations can provide for themselves. Then we get into that whole care about the planet mission. So there are some companies that have a mission to protect the planet. Some companies understand that their product either positively or negatively impacts the planet, and that therefore becomes part of their ethos. Another real reason, and often reason, that we see our clients particularly picking up the phone and making a call or an inquiry is because that there's a financial incentive to it. We're not going to go into what those may be right now, happy to follow up later, but ultimately, our governments across the globe who have come to recognize the impact of greenhouse gas emissions on climate change are having incentives available for organizations, buildings, building owners, et cetera, people in their homes as well, to reduce their carbon footprint. Brand differentiation. That's a big one where you see first movers, those that who understand the opportunity are taking the first step to differentiate themselves from others so that they can stand out and attract more revenue. There's obviously the risk compliance piece. So as we know, several industries in the economy, specifically Air Force, automotive, those that are working directly for governments are being asked to demonstrate their compliance with protocols and standards. And so there is that risk aversion or that risk mitigation strategy that is compelling many people to move into the emissions discussion. So we'll move on now specifically to why are we here and what are we talking about? So there are 4 main scopes of carbon greenhouse gas emissions. Scope 1, direct carbon emissions. This is emissions that your organization or you create directly. Scope 2 is indirect. That's from purchased energy and water. And then scope 3, the broadest of the categories, talks about emissions coming from the value chain. And we're going to get into each individually now. So let's talk a little bit about direct carbon emissions. These are emissions that your company creates from its buildings, its fleets, its planes, its assets that it owns. So we've got some examples here to consider as we're going through this conversation. Not all companies have a lot of scope 1 emissions. Some that are professional service firms like Emerald. We don't own buildings. We don't own cars. So our scope 1 emissions are limited to the furnace in the building that we own, that we lease from, that we're using for heating. Others who are in the manufacturing space have a lot of scope 1 emissions. And I'll note that the majority of what we're seeing the movement towards of understanding and starting to report their emissions is coming out of that manufacturing space. And so if any organization serves that space, as I'm seeing the future coming to be, and as we're seeing the efforts internationally to get better at our reporting, if there's anybody in a value chain of a manufacturing organization, aerospace, automotive, again, the governments, you're eventually going to be asked to report. Your scope 1 and scope 2 emissions are your customers' scope 3. So one of the first things we always coach everyone to do is to really understand what your scope 1 emissions are, where they're coming from, and start to develop those tracking protocols of how you're going to measure how much scope 1 emissions you produce. As we think about scope 2, it's almost the easiest to articulate. It's the emissions from purchased energy and water. So for example, the electricity that serves your building, the water that you use in your process or in your day-to-day. Energy source can make a difference in your scope 2. So when you get those flyers or you have the call come in to say, we want to help you source your electricity, that can make a difference on how you are presenting in your scope 2. If your source energy is coming from renewables. So for example, the utility company that you get your electricity from has a large solar, hydro, wind portfolio for generation. Your scope 2 emissions are going to be lower than those who purchase from a coal-fired or a natural gas-fired power plant. Calculating water emissions is going to be, and is today, the more challenging to articulate. Water utilities are less, especially if we're looking at municipal water utilities, which make up the most of them, are not necessarily directly reporting their emissions as evenly and as readily as the electric utilities are. So getting a real grip on what the water emissions may be, it may be more challenging for some than others. So let's talk about scope 3 emissions, which is really where the dynamics of this discussion and how you start the process of understanding and reporting your emissions come from. They are from upstream and downstream activities. So let's talk a minute to discuss what that even means. So upstream activities, getting to your product and service. So did you have to buy supplies in order to make what you sell? Did you have to extract raw materials out of the ground, or did someone extract raw materials out of the ground to get you that product that you then do something to in order to sell? The transportation of those products, any outsourced activities that lead you to the production of your goods or service. All of those are scope 3 emissions. Also included in there is your leased assets. Also included there are your business travel and your commuting. So different from the emissions of your fleet that you may own, business travel and commuting in the gray fleet category is when your employees are driving their cars around to go meet clients, to go make a sales call, etc., or the airfare that you're taking, or the airline trip that you took. For example, I'm doing this webinar from Nashville, and we're recording the airline trip so that we can report our scope 3 emissions for that. So scope 3 on the upstream is really what gets you to the ability to sell your product, to distribute it, and then the downstream is what happens as you're selling your product. So that could include things like the retail stores in which your products are being sold, the transportation and distribution of the product to the retail store. It's the waste and perhaps the electricity that's being used by the product that is being sold. And so understanding where your organization falls in the scope 1, 2, and 3 category is really, and what emissions you generate is what's most important. And then having a general framework of understanding of where those that are in your value chain, what their impact is something that all organizations that are ultimately going to be reporting need to know. So what I'm saying here is, if you'll remember just a couple of minutes ago, I said your own scope 1 and 2 is another company's scope 3 emissions. So if your clients are now starting to report their scope 3 emissions, they are going to look to you to report your scope 1 and 2. Not today necessarily, but soon we're all going to be looking at our scope 3 and having to find ways and processes to support those that are in our value chain and articulating their scope 1s and 2s. So if we just move on next to getting started with your baseline inventory. So in today's discussion, we're not necessarily going into the deep how to report, talked a little bit about what the definitions of each of the scopes are, why understanding the scopes is important. What we want to do now is focus on what are some of the first steps you can take to get started. The clear first step is understanding your why. Why is it that you are asking the question, or your organization is asking the question as to what should we be reporting or how we should be reporting? Clarifying what the reporting standards are. There are lots of reporting standards that are compelling organizations to get into the greenhouse gas emissions process and setting their net zero goals. For example, we report to the greenhouse gas emissions protocol. So understanding what is being required of you is also a key point, because that will influence how you are going to set out on your path. And it is new. There are organizations that have a deep understanding of how to get organizations started with their baseline report, setting goals, and developing future reports. One of the things that we know to be true is there's just a need to start. And so understanding what you are able to report on today, creating a framework around that, and then getting started with the reporting. So Lisa, I think we're about ready to get into our questions and answers. So I'm going to tee you up to come back on and get yourself off mute, and we'll go with that. So if we just, let me get over to the next slide, and off we roll. Do you want to tee me up, Lisa?
Fantastic. Thanks everyone for participating. We do have a couple of questions that came in, but while we're answering questions, please feel free to pop those, any additional ones that you may have, in either the chat or the Q&A feature. I'm not sure the Q&A feature is working, but oh, yep, it is. Okay, so we've got questions coming in both directions. First question is, how do you categorize business travel versus commuter travel when the company does not own vehicles? Therefore, employees are driving their own personal cars.
That's a great question. So you might remember that when we were discussing scope 1, it was the fleet, the company-owned fleet. And then you have the gray fleet, which is in scope 3, which is your employee-owned cars that are being used, or other people's vehicles being used in service of your company's product and service distribution and sales. So let's talk about that. If the employee is driving a company car to and from their work, that is scope 1. If the employee drives his or her own car to and from their work, that is scope 3. One of the ways that companies can start to get a handle on the gray fleet, which might be a little less clear than those with a scope 1, even though the process is exactly the same, you need to know A, how many people are driving to and from work, B, what are they driving, and C, how far are they driving? And then with the tools and resources available to do the calculations, there is emissions set per mile, and it do the math based on the people, the type of car or vehicle, and the distance, and that is how you are able to calculate what the either scope 1 or 3 emissions is. What's our next question? You're on mute.
Thanks, that makes a lot of sense. The next question is manufacturing collection of scope 1 data. Are companies doing work beyond estimates at this point? So within manufacturing collection of scope 1, are we seeing that companies are doing what they estimate, or are they improving, not quite reaching?
So, that's a really good question, and something that I do want to highlight specifically. we have to start somewhere. You know, even in the, I like to use the analogy that carbon emissions reporting, understanding your baseline, setting goals, and moving towards carbon neutral is a process not dissimilar to starting on a new health campaign, a health kick, where you're going to start counting your steps, counting your calories, understanding how the two interplay. So we have to start somewhere. And yes, there are some organizations well poised to articulate exactly what their scope 1 emissions are, because they have the data, they have been tracking, there are calculations, and out we come with the emissions. And then there are situations where we're not 100% sure what the data is. Like, for example, you may know where your employees live, you may know who drives to work, so therefore you could do a calculation on distance, but you haven't yet calculated based on the exact vehicle that they're driving. So that might be more of an estimate than a specific. That's not, I'm using that as the example to articulate to the manufacturing question. If the exact data isn't available, but you have pieces of it, then it's an estimate. And as you're moving forward from today, baseline year, to the future, in the reporting process, you clarify what is the actual data, what is the estimate data, what is in your report, and what is not in your report. So for example, if you know that there is another category of a scope emissions that your company has impact on, but you're not ready to report it, it's like a disclosure. This report is our report today, but it doesn't include the following. And we are working on the following and having a plan to address it, to report it with greater accuracy, and to include it going forward. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that helps. I think that clarifies. And then this last one, you talked in your presentation about scope 1 and scope 2 and the difference with energy, but this question I think wants to dig in a little more. Why is natural gas heat in scope 1 emissions, where electric heat is in scope 2 emissions?
Yeah, so that's a really great question. So it's consumed on the site, meaning the equipment that's being combusted on the site in the furnace, versus the combustion of the natural gas to make electricity isn't being combusted off-site at the generation source or site, right? So it's the scope 1s are things that are occurring on site that are in your control based on the assets that you own or are directly affecting.
So that's it for questions for today.
Unless anybody else, yeah, does anybody have a closing question?
While we're waiting to see if anybody pops in any other questions here, I just wanted to make note that we appreciate you being here, and we do have a next webinar coming up on November 3rd at 11 a.m. So we're doing these the first Thursday of the month. And we will have a special guest, Jack Brunner, who is a co-founder of the Carbon Neutral Club. And the topic is Employees Matter in Carbon Reporting.
I'll jump in, Lisa, if you don't mind for a second, just before you do that. Jack is awesome. So we work closely with Carbon Neutral Club, and actually we're a member of them, and our employees are reporting their carbon through them. He's a dynamic individual. Just love the story behind the Carbon Neutral Club, and I'm so excited that he's going to be part of next month's webinar series. I see another question popped in.
Yeah, about any good examples for scope 3.
Right. So you know what? I'm going to go back to this slide for a second, just to give us something to look at from. So, of course, we talked a little bit about the business travel. We talked about purchased goods and services. So what is a purchased good? Your supplies. It could be the raw materials for the products and services that you make. It could be the scope 1 and scope 2 emissions from the law firm that serves you, or the marketing firm that serves you. The extraction and manufacturing of raw materials. So the gasoline that's burned in order to dig out of the ground or to transport whatever the raw material, goods and the products to you, or the raw materials out of the ground to its processing plant. Those are some examples of scope 3 that come from the upstream and downstream, the scope 1 and 2 from the retail stores is your scope 3 emission, if that makes sense. So lots of examples of scope 3. It's got 14 different categories to dig into, and we're happy to follow up to help clarify what all fits into that.
Well, thank you, Laura, for your time and presentation from Nashville, Tennessee, live from the hotel motel room. We appreciate your time. And if anybody has any additional questions, feel free to reach out to any of our team, but Laura's contact information is listed right there on the closing slide.
Thanks, Lisa, for hosting us today.
You got it. With that,
right.
I think we'll end, and we look forward to seeing you all next month.
Bye.
Bye-bye.